Have you ever wondered what happens when a ceasefire doesn't really mean peace? Sounds strange, right? But this is what's happening right now between Israel and Iran. What could have been the end of a conflict is leaving much more than just a truce. And to understand this, it's necessary to know what's behind this ceasefire, who proposed it, how it was negotiated, and most importantly, why it's being seen as a temporary rather than a permanent solution. If you imagine a ceasefire as a kind of peace agreement, it's time to change that perspective. A ceasefire in this context is not a simple handshake or a promise that the guns will completely stop firing. It's much more than that. Imagine war as a game of chess between two powers that have been moving at every corner of the board for years. Now suddenly, they are given a break to reorganize. But what happens when that break isn't enough? What happens when, while some rest, others are already looking for their next move? This ceasefire agreement between Israel and Iran is a clear example of what happens when the world faces a truce that is more filled with questions than certainties. After 12 days of clashes, threats, airstrikes, thousands of lives lost, and uncertainty in the air, US President Donald Trump stood on the international stage to announce what appeared to be a definitive solution: a ceasefire mediated by Qatar, with the active participation of Germany and China. Does this sound too simplistic? In reality, there are many nuances to this. On the one hand, all countries involved recognize the ceasefire as a first step toward calm. But on the other, reports from the region show that this ceasefire has been merely a strategic pause rather than a real solution. The ceasefire, which was initially scheduled to last only 12 hours, soon became a topic of debate. How can peace be guaranteed when tensions continue? When the stakes are so high and the interests so high, can we really trust that it will be respected? And this brings us to a more important question. What happens when the parties involved disagree with what has been decided? This is where things get complicated. While Israel accepted the agreement, the Israeli defense minister had already ordered additional attacks on Iranian facilities, accusing Iran of violating the ceasefire. On the other hand, the Iranian government has maintained a contrary position. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi flatly stated that there was no formal ceasefire agreement and that they would only cease their military operations if Israel halted its attacks. A diplomatic trap, a simple word game to buy time. Meanwhile, bombs continued to fall on Gaza, and the casualties, both civilian and military, mounted. What does all this mean for the region and the world? It's not simply a matter of stopping shooting. It goes deeper than that. A ceasefire, in a context like this, is a reflection of a much more complex situation. It speaks of power, influence, territorial control, strategic resources. It speaks of a struggle for dominance, for stability, or even for the destruction of everything the other represents. And the worst of all is that, even though they tell us there is peace, we know that the shadows of war are still present, lurking, waiting for a new outbreak. Imagine for a moment that you are in the shoes of a civilian in Iran or Israel. The government tells you there is a ceasefire, that everything is under control. But when you look around, the sirens continue to wail, the fear hasn't dissipated, and the streets remain a battlefield. This isn't a fictional scenario. It's the reality of many citizens caught in a war they didn't choose. For them, the ceasefire is an illusion, a momentary flicker of calm before the storm erupts again. This is where the real complexity of the ceasefire lies. It's not just about agreeing to a break between the sides. It is, in many cases, a waiting and seeing agreement. Meanwhile, international actors, from the United States to China, continue to move their pieces on the geopolitical chessboard, negotiating, making deals, and in some cases, keeping their own interests out of the spotlight. And we, the world's spectators, we stand by, watching, waiting for someone to finally put an end to this endless cycle of violence. But what if I told you that this ceasefire could be just the beginning of an even bigger war? It's not just a pause in arms, it's a reset, a strategic recalibration that could open the door to an even more devastating conflict. And the most intriguing thing about all this is that the darkest details of this agreement have yet to come to light. The real negotiations, the ones that could truly change the course of this conflict, are happening behind closed doors, away from public view. Now you might be wondering, what does all this mean for the future of Israel and Iran? What lies behind this seemingly fragile truce? Can we really believe that peace is just around the corner, or are we simply facing another chapter in a never-ending war? Now that we know what a ceasefire actually means in this context, an inevitable question arises. What is really at stake here? If you thought the truce would be a definitive solution, it's time to take a look at the stakes of this conflict. Far beyond the obvious. Because when we talk about Israel and Iran, we're not just talking about two nations at war. We're talking about a conflict with global implications that could shift the balance of power throughout the Middle East and beyond. Imagine for a moment that you are a world leader. All of your country's economic, political, and military power is at stake. You have to consider the influence of major powers like the United States, Russia, and China, which are not just observers, but key players in this scenario. When Israel and Iran enter into conflict, it's not just about what happens between them, but also how this conflict resonates globally. For Israel, this is not an isolated conflict. The very existence of its nation is constantly under threat, not only from Iran, but also from radical groups operating in the region that aim to wipe Israel off the map. The ceasefire, then, is a temporary pause in a war that Israel views as a fight for survival. While Trump's agreement may provide momentary relief, tensions between the two countries remain sky-high. The Israeli government knows that every minute of peace could be exploited by Iran to reorganize its forces and reinforce its military presence in the region, something that should never be underestimated. Therefore, accepting this ceasefire for Israel is a strategic act that may be necessary, but it is not a definitive solution. On the other hand, we have Iran, a country that has played a riskier card. Iran is not only a state with ambitions for power, it considers itself the protector of Islamic nations. Confronting Israel is not only a matter of security, but also a matter of national and religious pride. Iran has historically been the counterweight to Western influence in the Middle East, and the idea of submitting to a peace agreement without obtaining tangible benefits would be a symbolic defeat that could affect its legitimacy within the region. Iran, therefore, is willing to play a much longer game. The ceasefire for them could be seen as a maneuver to buy time, strengthen their allies, and reorganize their forces. Furthermore, let's not forget that Iran has been accused of using the ceasefire as a strategy to reshape its military power in the Middle East. And it's not just Iran and Israel. The interests of regional actors like Syria, Hezbollah, and other groups operating in the region make any truce even more complex. Each of these actors has its own agenda and objectives, adding an extra layer of uncertainty to the effectiveness and duration of this ceasefire. But what about global interests? This is where the balance of power comes into play. The United States, Israel's main ally, has been actively involved in the region for decades. Although Trump brokered this ceasefire, the United States has strategic interests that go far beyond a simple agreement between two countries. The Strait of Hormuz, which connects the Persian Gulf to the rest of the world, is one of the most important trade routes for oil. The security of this area is key to global economies, and any disruption to this flow could affect the price of oil and destabilize international markets. As for Russia, although it has not been directly involved in mediating this ceasefire, its influence on the Iranian government cannot be ignored. Russia has been a strategic ally of Iran on several fronts, from nuclear policy to its intervention in Syria. How will this ceasefire affect the relationship between these two geopolitical giants? Will they be able to remain neutral, or will they be forced to intervene if tensions between Iran and Israel flare up again? What's at stake then is much more than a simple war between two countries. It's a struggle for power, influence, resources, and strategy on a global level. Every move made, every word spoken, will have far-reaching consequences. The ceasefire may be just the beginning of a shift in the power dynamics in the Middle East, and the negotiations may not end there. If you thought this conflict was isolated, think again. It's just one piece of a much larger puzzle. Meanwhile, the civilian population, both in Israel and Iran, remains largely forgotten. In the darkness of negotiations and political strategies, it is the citizens who suffer the direct consequences. Thousands of human lives are at stake, and the real question is whether this ceasefire is enough to ensure that innocent people do not pay the price for a conflict that goes far beyond what we can imagine. If you thought world politics was a distant prospect, let me tell you that Donald Trump has just brought us all back to reality. The former President of the United States, a figure who has been so controversial in his time, is once again at the center of international attention. But what does he have to do with the ceasefire between Israel and Iran? He is not a mere spectator on this stage. Trump, it seems, has a deeper hand in this conflict than we might imagine. To understand why Trump's intervention is so important, we need to go back a bit in the history of his administration. During his term, the relationship between the United States and Israel was never closer. Trump made the defense of Israel one of his most visible banners, moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, a symbolic gesture that angered many in the Arab world and generated great tension. Regarding Iran, the relationship has never been less than tense. Trump's decision to withdraw the United States from the Iran nuclear deal, known as the JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, was a landmark move. President Trump made it clear that he would not tolerate Iran continuing its nuclear program, and the sanctions against that country were harsh. But what motivates him to enter into these ceasefire negotiations now? The first thing we need to consider is that Trump, in his final term as president, made it clear that he enjoyed being the mediator of major international agreements. He had already played an important role in the normalization of relations between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, which even earned him a nomination for the Nobel Peace Prize. In other words, Trump is now looking for an opportunity to leave a legacy in international politics, something that will allow him to go down in history as a leader who achieved something significant. However, not everything is so simple. Trump's mediation in this ceasefire is not without suspicion. Despite his stance of unconditional support for Israel, in this case, his intervention could be seen as a calculated move to maintain his influence in the region. The United States' relationship with Iran remains a sensitive issue, and although Trump attempted to impose his own vision on the Persian country during his term, he is now operating in a post-presidency context, where the decisions of his successor, Joe Biden, are charting a different course. The question that arises is Trump really acting as a neutral mediator, or is he simply seeking to align U.S. interests with those of Israel at the expense of Iran? Because while the ceasefire benefits both sides, the consequences of this intervention may be more complicated than it seems. The international community is watching closely, and the true motivation behind this mediation may have far greater ramifications than most observers are willing to admit. In this scenario, Trump becomes a key player, but not the only one. Israel, of course, is cautiously watching every word and every gesture. Prime Minister Netanyahu has already stated that Israel has accepted the ceasefire, but with reservations. It's not difficult to imagine that Israel could be waiting for the right moment to step back from the negotiations and launch an offensive if it believes its interests are at risk. This makes Trump a mediator between two countries with completely opposing visions, but which ultimately seek the same thing: power and stability. On the other hand, Trump's figure also adds an element of uncertainty. How will Iran respond to his intervention? Will they see it as sincere mediation or as yet another imposition by the American empire, pursuing its own interests through an agreement that favors Israel? What is clear is that beyond his role as former president, Trump continues to wield a power of influence that should not be underestimated. In international politics, personal relationships between national leaders play a fundamental role, and Trump remains one of the most polarizing figures. Trump's intervention also puts the United States' role in the Middle East into perspective. Over the years, US presidents have been key players in almost every peace agreement or military intervention in the region. Trump, although a businessman rather than a traditional diplomat, understood the importance of playing his cards on this geopolitical board. However, as we will see later, this intervention is not as clear-cut as it seems. Instead of ending the war, it could have sown the seeds for an even greater conflict, something we have seen in the past with other agreements that seem to offer a definitive solution. If you thought the major powers were playing their role from the shadows, prepare to be surprised. Because amid this ceasefire between Israel and Iran, three players have become key pieces of the international puzzle: Qatar, Germany, and China. And no, we're not just talking about secondary figures making headlines. These countries are playing a role that could change the course of the Middle East conflict. First, let's talk about Qatar. Often forgotten on the global geopolitical stage, Qatar has positioned itself as a crucial mediator in various tensions in the region. How did it do this? Well, through money and diplomacy. This small but influential country, with one of the world's largest natural gas reserves, has used its economic power to forge a network of relationships with key players in the Middle East. Although not often viewed as a military power, Qatar has gained prominence for its ability to mediate conflicts, especially in delicate situations like the one we are witnessing between Israel and Iran. Its intervention, in this case, is not just an act of political generosity, but a strategic move. By maintaining good relations with both parties, Qatar ensures its political and economic stability while continuing to play a key role in international diplomacy. And why is Qatar's role in this conflict so important? Because its influence has made the ceasefire possible. It was this country that, with the support of other powers such as Germany and China, facilitated the rapprochement between Israel and Iran. Through its diplomatic channels, Qatar managed to bring them to the negotiating table. And despite the tensions, Qatari mediation remains one of the factors that could ensure that the ceasefire is not just a parenthesis, but the beginning of something more substantial. Although this does not mean that at the same time, Qatar is looking out for its own benefit, since in such a volatile environment, having an ally like Israel or Iran on its side could mean the difference between being a small player or a giant in the region. Now let's turn to Germany, another key player in this scenario. While Germany is not a military power in the strict sense of the word, its economic and political influence in Europe makes it a key player. Furthermore, the country has a consolidated diplomatic position, largely due to its commitment to global peace and stability. Regarding its relationship with Iran, Germany has been one of the main negotiators in the nuclear deal with that country, giving it a privileged position to mediate in situations like the current one. Germany has the power to influence not only politically, but also economically, exerting pressure on both sides to respect the terms of the ceasefire. Its capacity for dialogue and its leadership in the European Union give it a significant advantage at any negotiating table, especially when tensions are so high. And then we have China, which, although it sometimes doesn't receive the attention it deserves, has established itself as a global power that cannot be ignored. China has been a strategic player in many international conflicts, and its influence in the Middle East has been growing. Why? Because as with many other countries, China has significant economic interests in the region. Energy trade, access to natural resources, and geopolitical alliances are just some of the factors that explain its involvement in this conflict. China, with its diplomatic and economic power, has been a key player in the ceasefire talks, ensuring that the proposed solutions are accepted by all involved parties. Its negotiating power is unquestionable, and its intervention not only seeks to ensure peace in the region, but also to ensure that its own interests are served in the long term. With the intervention of Qatar, Germany, and China, the ceasefire between Israel and Iran takes on a much more complex dimension. It is not just a bilateral agreement between two nations at war. It is the result of a series of multilateral negotiations involving global and regional powers, each with its own agenda. Although the eyes of the world are on Israel and Iran, what is really happening at this negotiating table is a much larger power game. Each actor is seeking to maximize their own interests, and although they all claim to seek peace, we must not lose sight of the fact that diplomacy is sometimes an art of managing tensions and, above all, knowing when and how to exploit them. What is clear is that without the active mediation of these countries, the ceasefire would not have been possible. Each of them is playing a crucial role in maintaining balance in such a volatile region. But as always, we must ask ourselves, what happens after the ceasefire? Will this agreement be just a pause in a fight that is still far from over? And most importantly, who will really be winning at the end of all this? This is where the story begins to take an interesting turn. Because while we have been told that a ceasefire has been reached, we cannot help but wonder, is it really a ceasefire or simply a strategic pause? If we look closely, we will see that this ceasefire is not as clear-cut as it seems. In the world of diplomacy and war, appearances can be deceiving. The very concept of a ceasefire, as we understand it in traditional conflicts, is complicated. A ceasefire should mean that the guns stop clanging, that troops withdraw, that the suffering ceases, at least temporarily. However, in the case of Israel and Iran, this agreement seems more like a truce than a true resolution. Why? Because even though a temporary cessation of hostilities has been agreed upon, tensions have not disappeared. The picture remains the same. Relations between the two countries are deeply conflicted and remain fraught with mutual distrust. Furthermore, the fact that both Israel and Iran have violated the terms of the ceasefire practically from the moment it was announced raises serious questions about the effectiveness of this agreement. Israel has ordered airstrikes in response to what it considers to be Iranian violations, while Iran has continued to attack other key areas in the region. The question is, can we really talk about a ceasefire when both sides continue to operate as if nothing has changed? World leaders may declare peace, but the reality on the ground is different. If we think about it, this ceasefire seems more like a momentary respite, a pause, so both sides can reorganize their forces and seek the opportune moment to resume hostilities. It's a strategic move, not a gesture of goodwill. Iran, for example, has been using this time to reinforce its positions, and Israel knows that any day it could once again be at the center of an Iranian offensive. And here an important question arises. Are we facing a ceasefire or a battle for control of time? This is a conflict with no clear beginning or end. Therefore, the ceasefire, even if it is presented to us as progress, could simply be a parenthesis in a much longer and more complicated conflict. As if that weren't enough, we must consider the influence of external actors. The fact that countries like the United States, China, and Germany mediated this agreement doesn't necessarily mean that all interests are aligned. In fact, what we have here is a diplomatic dance in which each of these actors is seeking to secure its influence in the region, not so much to promote peace between Israel and Iran. True peace will never be just a matter of a signed agreement on the table. Rather, it is an ongoing process, and this ceasefire, although celebrated, is only part of that process. As for the civilian population, this ceasefire doesn't seem to offer much real relief. The bombings, threats, and fear are still very present. Life in Gaza, Jerusalem, and Tehran remains a constant struggle, and the ceasefire doesn't change the reality of millions of people trapped in a seemingly endless conflict. For many, this truce is nothing more than a respite for the powerful, not for the innocent. Can we then trust that this ceasefire will be more than a mirage? It's not easy to say. History has shown us that ceasefires often become moments of recalibration for the sides, not definitive solutions. While peace agreements are important, what really matters is what happens after they are signed. Mistrust remains the great enemy, and when that mistrust is as deep as that between Israel and Iran, a ceasefire agreement can simply be another chapter in a long novel of unresolved conflicts. And do you think this ceasefire will be successful? Or on the contrary, are we just seeing a pause as the two sides prepare for the next round of fighting? Now that we've analyzed the fragility of this ceasefire, it's time to focus on how the two key parties in this conflict, Iran and Israel, are behaving. At the end of the day, they are the ones who have the power to decide whether the truce will truly be effective or if it will just be an opportunity to catch their breath and prepare for the next offensive. How both countries handle this delicate moment can tell us a lot about their long-term intentions. Let's start with Israel. Despite having formally accepted the ceasefire, what we're being told from the highest echelons of the Israeli government is a completely different story. Israel's defense minister has already given orders to attack Iranian positions, accusing Tehran of violating the agreement. While it's true that Iranian ceasefire violations could justify this type of response, we can't ignore the fact that Israel has a long history of using these ceasefires as a way to buy time and reconfigure its own strategy. It's almost like a chess move. They accept the ceasefire to reposition themselves and wait for the right moment to launch a new strike. This leads us to ask, are they truly committed to peace? Or are they simply waiting to make their next strategic move? Israel, with its military power and advanced technological resources, knows that war is not only a matter of the battlefield, but also of preparation. In this sense, the ceasefire becomes a kind of space to reorganize and optimize its positions in the region. This is not to say that there are no elements within the Israeli government that seek peace, but national security interests remain the top priority. On the other hand, Iran, although less transparent in its approach, also has much to gain from this temporary truce. The Iranian government, led by figures such as Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, has insisted that the ceasefire will only occur if Israel stops its attacks. However, despite these statements, Iran has shown no signs of abandoning its strategic positions or reducing its military presence in the region. In fact, many analysts maintain that Iran is using this ceasefire to reinforce its defense lines, mobilize more resources, and strengthen its alliances in the region, such as with Syria and Hezbollah. Most interesting of all is that, despite public statements from both countries, actions on the ground seem to contradict official rhetoric. While the Iranian government claims to be committed to peace, its actions suggest otherwise. Attacks in other key areas, and a constant strengthening of its military capabilities. For its part, Israel, while claiming the truce is a positive step, continues to carry out airstrikes against Iranian targets, demonstrating that war remains a priority in its strategy. This behavior reflects a reality that is very difficult to accept, that both countries continue to live under the logic of war, even while they talk about peace. The ceasefire is merely a game of appearances, a bid for time. No one is willing to give in completely. In fact, in some political circles, it is believed that this truce could be seen as an opportunity to prepare the ground for an even larger conflict. After all, the history of this conflict is full of moments in which a temporary peace has only served to inflame tensions and later resume fighting. This leads us to a somewhat grim conclusion. Although the governments of Iran and Israel have officially accepted the ceasefire, The reality on the ground is very different. Both countries are preparing for whatever comes next, and not necessarily for peace. Rather than stopping fighting, they are rather waiting for the right moment to resume their disputes, because in practice, this war seems to have no clear end. If we have learned anything over the years, it is that when national security interests are at stake, words do not always match actions. But how long can they continue playing this game of tensions and truces? Will this be a ceasefire that will break, or is there something else behind all this? It's easy to get caught up in the headlines and official government statements, but the real question underlying this entire conflict is how ordinary people, the civilians caught in the middle of this endless war, are experiencing it. What do Israelis and Iranians think about the ceasefire? Do they truly believe it can bring them some peace, or are they simply seeing a new phase of the conflict that will drag them in once again? Let's start with Israel. For most Israeli citizens, living under the constant threat of attacks, missiles and bombings is nothing new. Tension in the region has been a constant for generations, and the feeling of insecurity has become almost part of the DNA of everyday life. Although the Netanyahu government has accepted the ceasefire, many Israelis don't believe this is the end of the troubles. For many, it is simply a pause in the war, a respite that may be short-lived. On the streets of Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, people are accustomed to periods of calm, followed by outbreaks of violence. The attacks don't cease permanently, they just become more frequent. The occasional missile strike and the sirens that frequently wail at night are constant proof that war is never truly far away. The Israeli people know that, even if leaders sign ceasefire agreements, the reality is that there is always something simmering in the region, a threat that never completely dissipates. Therefore, while some may breathe a little easier, most know that this agreement may be nothing more than a pause for breath, but not a definitive solution. Fear, uncertainty, and mistrust continue to dominate Israeli life. In many homes, the question is not whether the ceasefire will last, but when the next wave of attacks will begin. Even those who support the government are skeptical, as the price of peace has never been cheap. The economic situation, the human casualties, and the constant threat of war weigh heavily on people's minds. In short, the Israeli people are tired of waiting for a peace that always seems out of reach. In Iran, on the other hand, the situation is not much different. While Iranians have lived under sanctions and international pressure for many years, the war with Israel adds another layer of tension and suffering. Speeches of unity and resistance are common in Iranian government propaganda, but the reality on the ground is different. For most ordinary citizens, this ceasefire does not represent a victory or real relief, but rather a brief pause in a war that remains a constant threat. Iran, despite its strong government and nationalist rhetoric, is also suffering the consequences of this conflict. International sanctions and economic pressures have left a deep mark on the daily lives of its citizens. Despite the image of unity the regime tries to project, internal division is palpable. Many Iranians, especially those living in the cities most affected by the war, are tired of living in a constant state of war. Iranian youth, who for the most part do not support the conflict with Israel, prefer to see change and an improvement in living conditions. However, few believe this ceasefire will bring anything lasting. For them, it is merely a truce that will allow them to continue surviving in an increasingly desperate situation. On the streets of Tehran and other cities, the atmosphere is one of caution. The population is accustomed to uncertainty. Iranians know that their country's politics are not their own, and that the future lies in the hands of leaders and international decisions. Although many support their government, a large portion of the population seeks peace, stability, and the opportunity to live a normal life. This ceasefire, as in Israel, is seen as a mere pause, an opportunity for the parties to reorganize before resuming fighting. Both peoples, Israelis and Iranians, share a common reality. They are trapped in a conflict they did not choose, but from which they cannot escape. the civilian population pays the highest price, bearing the impacts of decisions made at much higher levels. Peace, though desired, remains elusive. And even if governments celebrate a ceasefire agreement, the truth is that ordinary people know this is not the end of the war. It is only a truce, a respite from the endless cycle of violence that has marked their lives for so long. Often, when we think of armed conflicts, the first things that come to mind are the human losses, the destroyed cities, and the suffering of innocent people. However, the impact of war goes far beyond what is visible on the ground. One of the most profound and often underestimated effects of the war between Israel and Iran is the economic impact it generates, particularly on the oil market. And while this ceasefire may seem like a victory for peace, it could actually have far-reaching economic consequences, not only for the countries involved, but for the entire world. To understand this, we must first look at the crucial role the Middle East plays in the global energy supply. Iran and Israel are not only geopolitical players, but also key players in the global energy arena. Iran is one of the world's leading oil producers, and although its exports have been affected by international sanctions, it remains a major player in the energy market. On the other hand, Israel, although not a significant oil producer, has such strong geopolitical influence that any disruption to its stability can generate a domino effect, affecting economies around the world. When the ceasefire was announced, one of the immediate reactions in the markets was a drop in oil prices. Why? Because investors in the energy markets were anticipating an easing of tensions in the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most important shipping routes for oil transport. If threats of war and blockades of the strait are reduced, the supply of oil in global markets stabilizes, which tends to lower prices. This, at first, might seem like positive news for consumers, as gasoline and energy prices in general tend to fall. However, falling oil prices also have side effects, both positive and negative. First, falling oil prices could provide relief to economies dependent on energy consumption, such as those in Europe and North America. A drop in energy costs could foster economic growth by reducing production and transportation costs, bringing relief to consumers. On the other hand, oil-producing countries that rely on these revenues to finance their economies could face difficulties. Iran, for example, has already been suffering under a sanctions regime that has drastically reduced its ability to export oil. A further drop in crude oil prices could further aggravate the country's economic situation, which is already struggling to stay afloat. Furthermore, oil price movements are directly related to geopolitical tensions. When there is a conflict in the Middle East, crude oil prices tend to skyrocket due to uncertainty and fear of supply disruptions. In this case, the announcement of the ceasefire may have calmed the markets, but the question remains, will the calm continue, or is it just a matter of time before tensions resurface? And if that happens, oil prices could rise again, causing renewed volatility in global markets and impacting the global economy. However, not everything is negative for producing countries. If the ceasefire holds and the region stabilizes, it could open a new phase of economic opportunities for oil-producing countries, which could resume or increase their exports, especially if sanctions on Iran are lifted. An increase in Iranian oil exports could have a positive impact on that country's finances while easing pressure on energy markets. In turn, this increased supply could balance oil prices, further reducing volatility. What is clear is that although the ceasefire may seem like a diplomatic victory, the economic consequences are far from simple. Oil prices are a reflection of the tension and uncertainty in the Middle East. And while this ceasefire may offer a momentary respite to the markets, the long-term implications are complex. As prices fall, the economic stability of several countries may be disrupted by fluctuating crude oil prices and the resulting impact on the global economy. Are we really witnessing a stabilization of energy markets, or are we just seeing the calm before the storm? The question of how oil prices will develop in the future is closely linked to the evolution of this ceasefire and how international powers handle the situation. Energy, as always, will be a battleground both economically and politically, and tensions in the Middle East will continue to dictate the course of the global market. While attention is focused on the ceasefire between Israel and Iran, we cannot ignore the fact that this conflict is not occurring in a geopolitical vacuum. The implications of this confrontation go far beyond the borders of the two countries involved. The Middle East is a melting pot of global interests, and any disruption to the stability of the region can trigger a chain of effects that resonate in every corner of the planet. So while the focus is on the cessation of hostilities, we must ask ourselves, what does this mean for the world as a whole? First, let's consider the external actors with key interests in the Middle East. The United States, of course, plays a central role in this scenario. Despite the Joe Biden administration, which pursues a different foreign policy than Trump's, U.S. influence in the region remains monumental. The country remains Israel's main ally and therefore has a direct interest in any outcome of the conflict. But beyond Israel, the United States also maintains complex relationships with Gulf countries, such as Saudi Arabia, and with powers like Turkey and Egypt, whose interests in the region strongly influence power dynamics. China, for its part, has emerged as a power that cannot be ignored in this context. China's growing economic and political influence in the Middle East has disrupted traditional alliances. Its relationship with Iran, for example, has grown considerably in recent years, not only for commercial, but also strategic reasons. China seeks to guarantee the flow of vital energy resources to its economy, and in the resource war, Middle Eastern oil is a key player. Indeed, China has been a crucial partner for Iran, especially during times of international isolation by the West due to sanctions. China's relationship with Israel, on the other hand, is equally interesting. Although Israel has been a close ally of the United States, it has also begun to establish economic ties with China, especially in technological and commercial areas. This creates a rather complex situation. On the one hand, Israel must maintain its strategic relationship with the United States, but on the other, it cannot ignore China's growing economic power, especially in an increasingly multipolar world. And we cannot forget Europe. European countries led by Germany, France, and the United Kingdom are also deeply involved in the negotiations with both Israel and Iran. These countries have been key players in attempts to mediate the Iran nuclear conflict and have played a crucial role in forging international agreements, such as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA. Europe, despite its own internal challenges, continues to play a key role in regional diplomacy as it seeks to prevent the conflict from spreading and protect its own commercial and security interests in the region. The impact of this conflict also extends to the global economy. As we mentioned earlier, oil prices fluctuate dramatically with any threat to the stability of the Middle East. And oil is not just an economic issue, it's a security issue. The Strait of Hormuz, through which a large portion of the world's oil transits, is a point of great tension. If Iran or other actors in the region decided to disrupt oil traffic, the consequences would be devastating for global markets, with rising energy prices and a potential slowdown of global economies. But beyond the economic, the impact of the war in the Middle East also has repercussions in the humanitarian sphere. War and violence in the region have led to massive displacement, with millions of refugees seeking asylum in neighboring countries and Europe. The social and human consequences of the war in Syria, Palestine, and Iraq continue to shape global politics. The lack of access to basic services, the suffering of civilian populations, and the psychological consequences of living in a war zone are problems that, although not always in the media spotlight, affect all of humanity. Even more somberly, we must consider the impact of this conflict on the fight against terrorism and weapons proliferation. The Middle East region has been a breeding ground for extremist groups, and constant tensions only fuel these movements. The war between Israel and Iran could indirectly strengthen radical actors who find chaos and violence fertile ground for recruitment. And while many international actors, including the United States and Russia, have attempted to curb the proliferation of nuclear weapons in the region, the conflict remains a constant risk to global security. The war in the Middle East is not an isolated conflict. It is a conflict that involves the entire world. The decisions made by the leaders of Israel and Iran, and the agreements reached or broken, have ramifications in every corner of the planet, affecting global politics, the economy, international security, and, of course, the lives of millions of people. At the end of all this analysis, we come to an unavoidable conclusion. Although the ceasefire between Israel and Iran may seem like the closing of a conflictual chapter, it could actually be the beginning of something much bigger. The conflict, tensions, and rivalries do not disappear with an agreement to cease hostilities. Rather, what we are seeing is a pause in a conflict that has lasted for decades and is far from being fully resolved. The ceasefire, as we have seen, is nothing more than a temporary strategy, a move to buy time and reconfigure the forces at play. The governments of Israel and Iran, although they have accepted the agreement, continue to operate under a logic of mutual distrust, and each is using this truce to strengthen its positions. Foreign interventions, the economic impact, and diplomatic decisions further complicate this situation. As international actors move their pieces on this chessboard, the only thing we know for sure is that nothing happening in the Middle East has a simple solution. And what about ordinary people? The citizens of Israel and Iran, who have lived under the yoke of war and violence for years, have little reason to believe that this ceasefire will bring lasting peace. For them, this agreement is merely a pause in the endless cycle of conflict. Mistrust, fear, and suffering remain the hallmarks of their daily lives. Despite the ceasefire agreements, tensions remain, and the fear of the next escalation never completely disappears. The economic impact, which could have been a temporary relief for the markets, also makes it clear that this conflict is not just a regional issue. Fluctuating oil prices and global uncertainty remind us that the Middle East remains a key factor in global economic stability. And while the ceasefire could bring some respite to the markets, we cannot forget that any escalation could trigger far more devastating effects globally. Therefore, the crucial question remains, is this ceasefire the beginning of peace or merely a temporary respite before war returns with a vengeance? While we all yearn for a future without conflict, history has taught us that lasting peace in the Middle East is not something that can be achieved with a simple agreement. True peace requires deeper changes involving both global powers and local populations. This ceasefire, as positive as it may seem at first glance, is only a respite. The true struggle for peace, stability, and justice has yet to begin. And in the meantime, the eyes of the world will continue to watch, hoping that this ceasefire is at least the first step towards something bigger, a real shift in the power dynamics and the search for a peace that so far seems elusive. So, although we may see the sun shining a little brighter today after this agreement, let us not forget that the shadows of war still lurk, waiting for the right moment to return. The ceasefire has been signed, but the real battle for peace remains an even greater challenge.